The snow in Wisconsin came early that winter, thick and wet, clinging to wool coats and freezing in the hair of men who had never known such cold. December 1945, Camp McCoy. A line of Japanese prisoners stood in formation, their thin duffels packed, their faces pale with dread. Diesel trucks idled nearby, their exhaust blooming white clouds into the air. The trucks were GMC CKW 2.5-tonners, the deuce and a half that had carried America's armies across Europe and the Pacific. Now they were being used for a quieter duty, returning prisoners of war to their homeland. Sergeant William Red Carter, 24 years old and farm-strong, watched the line shuffle forward. He'd written in his log the night before, "Orders for repatriation tomorrow." What he did not expect, what he would never forget, was the sight of enemy soldiers begging to stay. Corporal Kenji Takahashi shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying to fight the tremor in his hands. He had survived Okinawa, survived surrender, survived captivity. Yet the thought of going home chilled him more than the wind. He glanced at Carter, eyes hollow with fear, and whispered to the man beside him, "America feeds even its prisoners better than Japan feeds its children." The words carried no bitterness, only despair. Carter, who didn't understand Japanese, saw the tone if not the meaning, a soldier too afraid of freedom. The trucks rattled as drivers revved engines, eager to get on the road. POWs climbed aboard reluctantly, boots crunching the snow. Carter noted their hesitation, the way some gripped the wooden sides of the vehicles as though trying to anchor themselves to American soil. He thought of his own farm in Iowa, where his mother would be cooking ham and eggs at that very hour. These men who had fought under the rising sun were about to return to a nation of ruins where breakfast might be boiled millet or nothing at all. He didn't know the half of it then. He only knew that the war's strangest image was not battle, but surrender's aftermath. Enemy soldiers clinging to captivity. In the hush between truck engines and shouted orders, Carter heard one voice rise, raw and pleading. The interpreter translated a moment later, "Do not send us back." Carter's pencil scratched across the page of his logbook that evening, capturing the detail for posterity. He didn't realize he was writing the first line of a mystery history would only half explain. The engines roared, snowflakes swirled. The trucks moved out, carrying men who no longer feared the enemy, only the hunger waiting at home. Okinawa, June 1945. The island reeked of cordite and decay, the air heavy with humidity and smoke from shattered villages. Takahashi remembered crawling from a cave with a white cloth tied to a stick, his body shaking as much from hunger as fear. His unit had been shattered by weeks of bombardment. He expected Americans to shoot him on sight. Instead, they waved him forward, ordered him to lie down, then bound his wounds with fresh gauze. He had braced for brutality. What came was procedure. Piles of surrendered weapons grew along the beach. The Arisaka Type 99 rifles, dusty, battered, some without bolts, were stacked in neat pyramids beside captured Nambu pistols. Across from them, American troops slung M1 Garands with practiced ease, their weapons clean, oiled, dependable. Even Takahashi, half-conscious with fever, noticed the contrast. His rifle had jammed in the last firefight. The American sergeant's weapon had fired flawlessly, each metallic ping of an empty clip a note of industrial superiority. War, Takahashi realized dimly, was not just courage. It was supply. And America's supply was endless. As the prisoners were processed, trucks arrived. Again the deuce and a half, engines chugging tirelessly. They ferried captives inland where rows of tents stood ready, cots aligned like soldiers on parade. To men who had slept on rock floors and jungle mud, the sight bordered on surreal. Rations came next: rice, vegetables, meat, even a pink, salty cube called Spam. Takahashi bit into it cautiously, expecting some trick. The grease coated his tongue, heavy and foreign, yet undeniably nourishing. He would remember that first taste as the moment his certainty in Japan's destiny began to crack. Later, when guards ordered prisoners to assist with clearing wreckage, Takahashi felt shame burn hotter than the Okinawan sun. Bushido had taught him surrender was cowardice. Yet here he was, alive, fed, and working under the watchful eye of an enemy who treated him like a man, not a beast. He thought of his mother in Hiroshima, wondered if she had rice that day, wondered if she would curse him for living when honor demanded death. That night, lying on an American cot, his belly full for the first time in weeks, Takahashi stared at the tent roof and understood why some men wept not in pain, but relief. Surrender had not been the end he was promised. It had been the beginning of a reckoning. Honouliuli, Oahu, late summer 1945. The camp sprawled in a humid valley, its red soil damp from afternoon rains, its barbed wire glinting beneath the Hawaiian sun. Rows of wooden barracks stood like small villages, each filled with men who only months before had fought in the jungles of Guam or the reefs of Saipan. The camp had a rhythm all its own: reveille at dawn, work details through the heat, roll call at dusk. To the Americans, it was orderly confinement. To the Japanese prisoners, it was a world of contradictions. Dr. Eleanor Hughes walked the camp's perimeter with a clipboard, her white uniform bright against the earthen backdrop. An Army dietitian from Kansas, she had been tasked with ensuring that even enemy prisoners received balanced rations. Her reports were precise: 3 meals per day, averaging 3,200 calories, including rice, bread, vegetables, and meat when available. Compared to rationing back home, coffee stamps, sugar limits, it seemed astonishing that the United States could feed not only its citizens and armies, but also its captives. Hughes knew why. Ships from the mainland, Liberty vessels crammed with canned goods and flour, docked weekly in Honolulu, bringing abundance that Japan could no longer imagine. The prisoners worked under the sun, tilling soil, planting vegetables, repairing camp structures. Some sang folk songs, their voices rising strangely cheerful above the clatter of hammers and the rustle of corn. Hughes noted their improved health. Men who had arrived gaunt now put on weight. Skin ulcers healed under clean bandages. In her clinical detachment, she did not dwell on the irony, but she wrote it down all the same. These men are healthier than when captured. For Takahashi, transferred here after Okinawa, the camp was a mirror of contradiction. The wire marked his captivity, yet the food and work gave him strength. He could not decide if he felt relief or shame when he lifted a hoe in the camp garden. His comrades argued quietly at night. Some dreamed of home, others dreaded it. Japan's cities, they whispered, were rubble. Families starved. Returning would mean dishonor and hunger. Staying meant life, though under the flag of the enemy. In the humid evenings, the smell of cooking rice drifted across the compound, carried on warm breezes. Hughes closed her logbook after another inspection, knowing the numbers told a story larger than medicine. America had not only won the war with steel and firepower, it had won by feeding its enemies into health. The moment came in the mess hall, not the battlefield. Takahashi carried his tin tray through the line, watching cooks ladle rice and vegetables, a slab of meat, and, most astonishing, white bread. The loaf was sliced thick, its crusts golden, the smell so rich he nearly staggered. He ate in silence, savoring every bite. When he finished, he noticed a soldier at the next table leave his tray half full, the bread untouched. Moments later, the remains were scraped into a galvanized bin bound for the pigs. Takahashi froze. It was more food than his family in Hiroshima might see in a week. He whispered to his bunkmate, "They waste more than we ever had." The words hung in the humid air, heavier than any rifle round. Carter, on duty that day, overheard only the tone, soft amazement mixed with despair. He would later learn the translation from an interpreter. Waste as evidence of power. It was a concept foreign to his farm-raised sense of thrift, yet undeniable. To the prisoners, America's waste was proof of impossibility. If a nation could discard bread, what could its armies not discard? Bullets, bombs, tanks. The numbers bore out the symbolism. The Quartermaster Corps issued roughly 140 pounds of bread per soldier annually. U.S. bakeries, some mounted on truck chassis, followed divisions across Europe and the Pacific, producing loaves by the millions. By 1945, America's food output exceeded 100 billion pounds per year. In Japan, rations had dropped below 1,000 calories a day, forcing civilians to eat millet, grass, or tree bark. The disparity was not just arithmetic, it was existential. That night in the barracks, men spoke in low voices. Some admitted they feared not death, but freedom. Back in Japan, their families starved, cities lay in ruins, and surrender carried shame. Here in captivity, they ate 3 times a day, their bellies full, their bodies healing. For Takahashi, the bread crust in the trash became a symbol more potent than the mushroom cloud, the proof that Japan's sacrifice had been for nothing. Carter scribbled in his log that evening, puzzled. "They look at our waste as power," he wrote. He didn't realize then that the crust of bread had become the impossible statistic, the one detail that showed why Japan could never win. Dr. Eleanor Hughes stood in the warehouse at Honouliuli, the morning sun slanting across neat stacks of crates. Stenciled words in black block letters shouted their origin: Quartermaster Corps, Chicago Depot. To her, the sight was as awe-inspiring as any battleship. Boxes of flour, barrels of sugar, tins of Spam, enough to feed thousands of men for months, arrived like clockwork, a river of abundance flowing across the Pacific. It was not luck. It was Detroit, Pittsburgh, Kansas, Iowa, and 100 other places working in unison. She understood in her quiet way that her task was not merely feeding prisoners. It was demonstrating the arsenal of democracy through calories. She compiled numbers, translating logistics into life. The United States had produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, nearly 10 times Japan's entire annual output. Spam production exceeded 100 million pounds per year, shipped in olive-drab cans to foxholes, warships, and now POW camps. Liberty ships, welded together in 42 days at West Coast yards, carried wheat from Nebraska and beef from Texas across seas where Japanese shipping had all but vanished. Even the wooden spoons the prisoners used bore markings of contracts filled by American factories. The prisoners saw the effects without understanding the system. To them, the warehouse was a miracle. To Hughes, it was math. America's GDP in 1944 had reached $228 billion. Japan's had sunk to barely $20 billion. A single Ford plant produced more trucks than Japan could manufacture in a year. One B-29 cost more than a Japanese destroyer, yet the Americans built hundreds. In the camp mess, men spooned rice and stew into their bowls. Hughes noted their color returning, their cheeks filling out. She compared her charts with initial medical reports: anemia vanishing, malnutrition reversed. America was winning the war in the stomachs of its prisoners. The irony was not lost on her. An enemy taught to view surrender as dishonor now thrived on American rations. Proof that democracy's strength was not only firepower, but its capacity to feed even those who had tried to destroy it. As Hughes left the warehouse, she paused to watch a truck unload more flour sacks, the driver whistling as he worked. She wrote in her notebook, "Even our captives eat from the factories of Detroit and the fields of Kansas." Half a world away, Hiroshima lay in silence. Mrs. Aiko Tanaka bent over a patch of weeds, her fingers raw as she pulled the green shoots to boil into soup for her children. The bomb had spared her family by geography, but not by hunger. Across Japan in late 1945, millions foraged for food. Rice harvests had fallen to 42% of pre-war levels. Government rations dwindled to a handful of millet, sometimes no more than 800 calories a day. Families boiled grass. Some starved. Letters traveled slowly, but rumors moved quickly. Civilians heard whispers that captured soldiers were being fed white rice in American camps. For mothers like Aiko, the irony was unbearable. She had watched neighbors collapse from malnutrition, had seen children chew bark to quiet their stomachs. And yet, men who had surrendered, men once branded cowards, ate better as prisoners than she could feed her children. It was not just injustice. It was a revelation of futility. At Honouliuli, Takahashi heard the news in fragments, letters, interpreters' notes, camp gossip. His homeland was starving. His family might be among them. Each bowl of rice he received in captivity carried the weight of shame, yet also relief. To return meant to face hunger and stigma. To stay meant life. That was the cruelest irony of all. American planes began dropping food relief in late 1945, the first trickle of aid that would become the Garrioa program. For Aiko, the sight of crates descending by parachute was like watching salvation fall from the sky, brought not by the emperor but by the very nation that had bombed her city. She whispered thanks and curses in the same breath. The contrast sharpened the prisoner's dilemma. Inside the fence, men grew healthier, laughing as they worked. Outside, their homeland withered. The abundance they witnessed daily, bread, meat, vegetables, was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial system that dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. For civilians like Aiko, and for soldiers like Takahashi, the truth became undeniable. America had not just defeated Japan. It had rendered Japan incapable of feeding its own. The sound drifted strangely across the Wisconsin countryside, Japanese folk songs rising above the rustle of corn stalks. It was late summer 1945, and Camp McCoy had turned its prisoners into farmhands. Under Sergeant William Red Carter's watch, the men moved through rows of golden corn, their hands practiced though their homeland's fields grew rice instead. Carter leaned against a fence post, M1 slung casually over his shoulder, listening with half a smile. He hadn't expected music. He hadn't expected to feel anything but suspicion. Yet here were enemy soldiers working with rhythm, their voices carrying across the American heartland like echoes from another world. Farm labor had become necessity. With so many Americans still overseas, Midwestern fields needed hands. Prisoners filled the gap. They worked in teams, harvesting, stacking, hauling. Each man received wages and camp tokens redeemable at canteens, small comforts like cigarettes or extra soap. For Takahashi, the work brought a strange dignity. His body grew stronger. His hands, once wrapped around a rifle, now turned soil. He sang because the rhythm felt human again, not martial. The technical detail, though invisible to the prisoners, was staggering. By war's end, more than 400,000 Axis POWs in America contributed millions of labor hours to agriculture, saving harvests that might otherwise have rotted. In Wisconsin alone, POWs picked apples, cut timber, and husked corn. Carter had grown up on an Iowa farm, and he knew what the work meant. Without these men, soldiers or not, American tables would have been poorer. The irony was sharp. Enemies once sworn to destroy democracy now helped sustain its families. The prisoners noticed something else. Tools never ran out. Tractors sputtered across fields fueled by gasoline Japan hadn't seen in years. Lunch for the work details included sandwiches, apples, milk, calories that dwarfed the ration cards their families clutched back home. One prisoner whispered, "Even their farmers eat like generals." Takahashi felt shame rise, yet he chewed the bread anyway. Survival always won. As the sun dipped low, Carter recorded the day's detail. 20 POWs, 8 hours each, cornfields cleared. The numbers seemed ordinary. Yet when multiplied across the country, the labor hours became part of the same American system that had defeated Japan. Not only soldiers in battle, but civilians in fields, factories, and farms, reinforced by the hands of captured enemies. Carter watched the men pack their tools. He wondered, not for the last time, whether these men would rather stay in his fields than return to their own. Dr. Eleanor Hughes spread the papers across her desk in the camp office, each column of figures a silent testament. Flour shipments, rice allotments, medical inventories, all neatly tabulated. Yet the numbers seemed almost surreal. She compared them with captured Japanese reports brought in by intelligence officers. The difference was not merely large, it was beyond comprehension. America's gross domestic product in 1944 had climbed to $228 billion. Japan's, strained by blockade and bombardment, fell to $20 billion. The disparity meant that while Japan struggled to build 9,000 aircraft a year, America rolled out 96,000. A single B-29 bomber cost more than an entire Japanese destroyer, and America built hundreds without pause. Hughes circled the statistic, her pencil pressing so hard it tore the page. This was the impossible figure, the one that told the story better than speeches. Democracy's factories had already decided the war before soldiers fired their rifles. In her warehouse tours, Hughes saw this truth manifested. Pallets of canned Spam stacked to the ceiling, barrels of sugar from Louisiana, wheat flour milled in Minneapolis. Even wooden spoons bore contract stamps from factories working 3 shifts. She recorded caloric totals, 3,200 daily per prisoner, and compared them to reports from Tokyo, 1,000 or fewer for civilians. The difference meant life or death. The prisoners themselves noticed without needing numbers. They saw the crates arrive on trucks, smelled the bread baking, tasted the butter melting on vegetables. They whispered about the abundance, sometimes in awe, sometimes in fear. For men who had fought under slogans of sacrifice, the reality was devastating. America could not only arm millions of men, it could feed its enemies as if they were allies. Hughes wrote her conclusion plainly. Victory was decided in the factory before it was confirmed on the battlefield. She closed her folder, knowing the report would move up the chain of command. To her, it was not poetry, but fact. Yet when she passed through the camp and saw the prisoners healthier than when captured, she understood that numbers could be flesh, and statistics could be the most decisive weapon of all. That night, the camp mess hall echoed with laughter and clatter. Hughes paused at the doorway, listening. Even the sound of spoons against bowls had become proof of democracy's abundance. The notice went up on the bulletin board at Camp McCoy one frosty morning. Repatriation orders for the next transport. Carter watched as the prisoners crowded forward, scanning the list. The reaction was not joy, it was dread. Murmurs rose, voices cracking with disbelief. For weeks, rumors had trickled in about famine in Japan, about families scraping bark from trees. Now the orders made the rumors real. Men would be forced to leave safety for starvation. Takahashi's name was there. His stomach clenched. He thought of his mother in Hiroshima, imagined her thin and gaunt. Returning meant hunger and dishonor. Staying meant life. Around him, men whispered frantically. One clutched Carter's sleeve through the fence and spoke in broken English. "No send, please." Others begged interpreters to relay their pleas. Some wept openly. The irony was unbearable. Soldiers once trained to die for the emperor now begged to remain prisoners of America. The army called it resistance to repatriation. Official reports noted the phenomenon, estimating numbers in the hundreds, though records remain imprecise. Carter wrote in his logbook, "They don't want to go back." To him, it was surreal. He thought of the winters on his farm, when food was tight but never absent, when even pigs ate better than what these men described from Japan. He couldn't imagine begging to remain in captivity, and yet here it was. The trucks arrived, engines grumbling in the cold. Prisoners shuffled forward reluctantly. Some hesitated at the steps, gripping the wood as if anchoring themselves to American soil. Guards had to coax them gently, reminding them the war was over, that home awaited. Carter saw the tears, saw men hide their faces in shame. He thought of his fallen friends on Leyte and wondered how they would feel seeing enemies plead for American mercy. Takahashi boarded, heart heavy, clutching a carton of American cigarettes given by a guard. It was a talisman, a reminder of abundance he would not see again. As the trucks rolled out, Carter scribbled his final note, "Do not send us back," they had said. The engines drowned the words, but the memory would linger. Snow fell again that night, blanketing the camp in silence. The war was over, but the strangest battle was still being fought, in the hearts of men who discovered captivity was kinder than freedom. The harbor wind cut sharper than any blade, carrying salt spray and the acrid tang of coal smoke. January 1946, U.S. Navy transports waited at the dock, gangplanks lowered, their gray hulls looming like steel walls against the sky. Prisoners filed in slow lines, duffels over their shoulders, guarded but not hurried. For many, the steps felt heavier than combat. Repatriation was supposed to mean homecoming. For Takahashi, it felt like exile from the only safety he had known since Okinawa. Carter stood near the gangway, checking names. He noted how the men clutched American items like charms, cartons of Lucky Strikes, chocolate bars, even empty Spam tins. These were not souvenirs. They were talismans, reminders of a life where meals came 3 times a day and boots stayed dry. Carter saluted absent-mindedly as the ship's officers called orders. He had guarded these men for months, watched them grow healthier than when captured. Now he watched them leave, and though they were the enemy, he felt something close to pity. The ships themselves spoke the language of America's dominance. Navy transports, many converted Liberty ships, had carried armies across 2 oceans. Now they carried prisoners home with the same precision. In 1946 alone, 1.3 million Japanese soldiers were repatriated under Allied command, a logistical feat as remarkable as any amphibious landing. Each vessel could carry thousands. Each voyage was plotted with the efficiency of a factory assembly line. The same industrial machine that had delivered tanks to Normandy and planes to Saipan now delivered men back to Japan's shattered shores. As Takahashi stepped onto the gangplank, he looked back one last time. Carter caught his gaze. For a moment, soldier and prisoner simply saw each other. 2 men separated by uniform, but bound by a war that neither had chosen. Takahashi raised a hand, not quite a wave, more a farewell to a world of impossible abundance. He whispered in his own tongue, "We lost long before surrender." The words were carried away by the sea wind. Below deck, the prisoners settled into bunks, the smell of oil and iron filling their lungs. Above them, waves broke against the hull, steady as the engines that turned for home. America had once been the enemy. Now, for some, it felt like the paradise they were leaving behind. Washington, spring 1946. In a wood-paneled conference room, charts hung on the walls like battlefield trophies. Generals and analysts sat around a long oak table, their uniforms crisp, their voices clipped. They were not discussing tactics or maneuvers. They were reviewing numbers, and in those numbers lay the final verdict of the war. One officer pointed to a graph, U.S. aircraft production versus Japan's. 96,000 American planes in 1944, fewer than 9,000 Japanese. Another pointed to steel tonnage, 90 million tons in American mills, 3 million in Japanese foundries. Wheat harvests, oil refining, ship launches. The disparities defied belief. A colonel spoke of GDP, $228 billion to $20 billion. A general summarized in plain language, "For every one they built, we built 10. For every pound of rice they rationed, we threw away 2. The room fell silent. The war had not been won only on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. It had been won in Detroit, in Pittsburgh, in the endless rows of Kansas wheat. Dr. Eleanor Hughes presented her own report, her voice steady. She outlined caloric statistics from POW camps. Daily rations, 3,200 calories per prisoner. Mortality rate, less than 1%. Then she compared Soviet figures, 30 to 40% of Japanese POWs dead in Siberia. Her conclusion was as stark as any casualty list. The arsenal of democracy fed even its enemies. That is victory as much as battlefield success. The officers nodded. They knew these reports would shape policy, reconstruction, even the coming Cold War. America had not just defeated Japan militarily. It had proven that democratic industry could outproduce and outlast any authoritarian regime. Bread and bullets, Spam and Sherman tanks, they were all weapons of the same system. One general leaned back in his chair, his voice reflective rather than triumphant. History will ask how we won. Let them see the charts. Let them see the warehouses. Let them see that even our prisoners grew strong while their people starved. The men around the table fell silent again, each one understanding that numbers could be as decisive as armies. The war's statistics were not abstractions. They were proof of a civilization's capacity to sustain itself, and even sustain those who had once sworn to destroy it. The fields outside Hiroshima stirred with green in the early 1950s. Aiko Tanaka knelt among rows of crops, her children laughing nearby, their bellies full for the first time in years. The tools she used bore markings from American aid shipments, stamped with stars and English letters she could not read. She remembered the hunger of 1945, the weeds boiled into soup. Now rice filled her pot again, supplied by the same nation that had once dropped fire from the sky. Gratitude and bitterness lived side by side in her heart, as inseparable as breath and body. Takahashi, returned from captivity, worked his own small farm with quiet determination. He rarely spoke of the camp, but his neighbors noticed the American cigarette tin he kept on a shelf, polished like an heirloom. It was a reminder that in his darkest hour, it had been the enemy who fed him. He carried the memory as both comfort and shame. The war had taught him that honor meant death. Captivity had taught him that survival could be its own form of truth. Across the Pacific, Carter returned to Iowa, his hands once again turning soil instead of rifles. He told neighbors about the war, about Leyte and Okinawa, but sometimes, when the conversation grew quiet, he mentioned the prisoners who begged to stay. Listeners shook their heads in disbelief. Carter would only shrug. They'd seen America, he said simply. That was explanation enough. The larger legacy unfolded in policy. The Gary Oa program poured $1.9 billion in food aid into Japan, preventing mass famine and laying the foundation for recovery. Factories once devoted to tanks now shipped tractors. Grain, once bound for soldiers, now filled civilian granaries. The same industrial democracy that had armed millions in war now fed millions in peace. America's greatest weapon proved not to be the bomb, but the capacity to sustain life. In time, veterans and civilians alike would look back at the paradox that Japanese soldiers once begged to remain in American custody, not from fear of punishment, but from fear of freedom in a starving homeland. It was the final irony of the Pacific War. Victory had come not only through firepower, but through bread, not only through battles, but through abundance. The story closed not with destruction, but with the quiet truth that democracy's strength lay in the simple, staggering fact: even its enemies were better off in its care.